We even saw some silver coverage on CNBC suggesting silver could hit a 9-year high of $30 per ounce this year. Well, hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics as we are continuing on our coverage of the silver world in early 2023. And fortunate to be joined once again by Dan Dickson of Endeavour Silver, who was on the show. Dan, it's been almost a year ago. I think it was early February when we did this last year, and quite a year in the silver world it's been, and a lot to dig into. So good to see you again and good to have you back on here. And how are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I'm doing relatively fine. It's been a little bit of a roller coaster then since last time we sat down, but always fun, keeps things interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those years in the silver world where we're close to back to that same price we were around last time. And maybe if you had been able to not look at the chart for a year in between then, might have been a little bit easier of a ride. But obviously going up into the $26 range, then down below 18 for a while and sitting back around $24 today. And it was interesting. I was taking a listen to our call last year, and that was right after Facebook had come out with some earnings and they were down 26% on the day. And you were talking about how, as we started with some of the rate hikes, that would be an interesting year with some of the stocks perhaps running into trouble. I guess silver ran into trouble as well there. Although, as we look back, it's interesting here, 2022 performance, silver actually finishing up 3.5% on the year, whereas a lot of the stock indices in the US and other locations around the globe where they had rates going up as well, really getting hit hard. So I thought perhaps that'd be a good point to start. Your thoughts on what we've seen over the past year and in the stocks relative to silver.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's what you're taught in textbooks. Interest rates are going up. You're going to see those multiples come down on equities, and so there's kind of a little bit, I'd say, no surprise there. Obviously, we're maybe coming to the end of this tightening cycle, and the Fed's obviously talking about maybe 25 basis points again, but at the end of the day, the velocity of those rate increases has slowed down, and now it's a question of how long do we pause at these interest rates, and then when do they loosen again, and worry about what probably is already here or coming is a recession for 2023. As you say, silver went from 26 to below 18. We probably even talked about it last year when we talked, or at the time, is we built up our inventory with the idea that we didn't want to fall into a falling knife. And sometimes silver, especially in the silver market, it overreacts. And I think we had that last year with getting to those low prices, and it quickly came back to 20 to 24. We sold a lot of that metal actually coming into year end as we're getting ready to build our Terronera projects. So we wanted to flip some of that inventory into cash, because we'll be spending that cash on the Terronera project this year.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that again because that's something I know a lot of investors have been interested in. And obviously, when you have that volatility in silver, although first, another thing that got a lot of coverage, at least here and other places in the silver community, was that we had a record deficit last year. And it was interesting, a couple of days ago, we even saw some silver coverage on CNBC suggesting silver could hit a 9-year high of $30 per ounce this year and outperform gold. Thoughts on the fact that we're seeing some more mainstream talk about silver, which is not traditionally the type of thing that we have happen. What would you say about that?
Well, obviously it's a positive. I mean, silver is a pretty special metal in the fact that it's got the monetary aspects and an industrial component to it. And if we kind of reverse out of this tightening cycle, everyone's going to prepare themselves for what comes next. And I think an obvious spot is store of wealth and protection from a monetary standpoint, and that bodes well for gold, but I think it's going to bode better for silver. As you said, we've been in a deficit position from a silver standpoint, and eventually that price has to, and then we've seen it start to reverse and kind of move back up. Whether we get to $30 this year or not, difficult to say. I think it's depending on what we're going to see from the Fed level with where we're at with interest rates and what's the economy on an overall basis doing. But pushing into the high 20s is definitely conceivable this year for silver. There's when I say there's two components to it, it's the monetary aspects there as well as industrial. And obviously, if we go into a recession, it might impact it from an industrial standpoint. But I really think the industrial components of silver is positioning itself that I don't see that market kind of going through a recession, that there'll still continue to be demand for silver just because of the greenification aspects to silver. So a lot of the fundamentals behind silver is driving probably what's being said on CNBC and why it's hitting mainstream is the higher silver prices. And I think once it's such a small market, silver. I mean, if you think about it, we produce 1 billion ounces of silver a year. 800 million comes from the mining aspect of it. About 200 million comes through recycling. So at today's prices, you're talking about a $24 billion industry. And when you have that small of an industry with potentially a lot of eyes that come on it, you're going to see very, very significant velocity in that volatility. And obviously that will maybe push prices up into the high 20s, into the 30s, and maybe hopefully one day we can hit record highs and break that $50 mark.
Yeah, and again, interesting to see that deficit in the midst of these interest rate hikes, where speaking somewhat to the demand of silver, hear from Nikki Shields, who participates at the LBMA conference, even going as far as saying silver in a shortage. And as I know you're well aware, we did see drawdowns in both the COMEX and LBMA. And she also mentions here silver expected to post deficits of more than 100 million ounces over the next 5 years. Obviously, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen over the next 5 years, but based on what you see coming out of the supply and a lot of the projects that are out there, I mean, we're not in an environment, even at the $24 silver, where people are running out to launch new projects. Do you think that's reasonable, that we'll continue seeing those deficits going forward?
Yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable, if I can say it that way. I mean, ultimately, from a supply standpoint, the amount of regulations there to kind of put new supply into the market is greater than what we've ever seen. So there's more barriers to entry to be able to kind of pick up those deficits. And there's two aspects that have been impacting us in our industry over the last kind of 5 years. The amount of exploration dollars that have gone into the ground has been quite low, so we haven't been able to replace what we've been depleting out of the earth. And I think that's part of it. And then anything that we have discovered, the fact from discovery to development to production is just taking a lot longer. I mean, there's a lot more eyeballs on sustainability and ensuring that we go through the right processes of changing kind of an economic landscape of a region. And I think that's important. I think sometimes governments can be awfully slow and impacts that ability to bring new production in. I don't know if that's going to change over the next 5 years. It's likely to get even slower just based on what we see from a government standpoint. And in our space, there's been a couple projects brought into the marketplace. Silvercrest, Las Chispas went into commercial production at the end of 2022. We saw Gatos come to market from an IPO standpoint at the beginning of 2022, and they've had their issues. I think we're set up really well with the Terronera project, and hopefully we can bring that into production at the end of 2024. But there's just not a lot of projects to be able to pick up that deficit in the supply. Of course, a lot of the silver comes from base metal mines, and maybe there's more base metal mines that are coming online. But again, those are generally really big projects that have a long lead time to put into production. So the 5 years that she had mentions for being deficits, it's probably a fair forecast.
Yeah, and when you're talking with investors, I know you're at a lot of the conferences and talking with people on a day-to-day basis. Does anyone seem to have any suggestion of how that deficit is going to be met? You talked about how governments are slow on responding to these things, yet they're putting the green mandates in place, which certainly would suggest that there's going to be that demand going forward. Are people talking about that yet, that you're in contact with? Or
you got to think, I'm in the mining space. I talk to a lot of mining guys. I think in our space we understand that, and we see it. It would be more the generalists or people trying to understand the silver space and whether or not we can reach that. And I just think people underestimate how much work's needed to put permits in place now for mines to bring that into production. Like I say, the people in the mining space understand that lead time. I don't think outside they do, especially not from a government standpoint. to try to, I mean, gosh, if you look across every industry, I'm sure every industry is asking for less regulations and for governments to understand what they actually do a lot better. And I think for the last 50 years, that's never gotten better. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But outside the space, I'd say no. Short answer.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this is something we're seeing in other industries. Obviously, since we last talked, we had the whole nickel market blow up, and here's Bloomberg: metal traders bracing for the next big supply squeeze. Inventories at a critical level. And here was an interesting quote: "We're at critical levels of inventory around the world. Prices are starting to reflect that. We're starting to see consumers wake up and recognize that the problems do exist." Now, they didn't talk specifically about silver in this one, but it seems like the kind of thing that applies to silver and that we are seeing in a lot of the different markets, where to do what the governments are talking about in terms of a green basis and otherwise, there's some sort of a gap coming up here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. It's not just in the silver, it's across all metals. Function of exploration dollars going to the ground, a function of lead times to be able to put discoveries into production, and then ultimately the change of what we're going to see from a greenification of this world and trying to go to low carbon. And fundamentally, if that's what we want to do, we're going to need these metals, and we just haven't put the investment into the ground to deliver these metals for the mandates that the governments are pushing out there. I mean, if you're positioned in the metals, hopefully that's a good thing and we see higher prices, because the one way we can manage supply and demand, or supply and demand gets to equilibrium, is a change in the price. And I think we are going to start seeing that. And we have had massive inflation over the last kind of couple of years, and I think that's going to continue a bit. Whether we can get down to the 2% inflation level that governments are targeting, probably doubtful, but we should see some of that price increase show up into the primary metals. It is a primary industry, and that will show up in our copper prices, our silver prices, or ultimately gold prices.
Yeah, and you talked about that a little before, but in terms of inflation and things going on that side, not that far off from the Fed's next meeting. Looks like the market now pricing in a quarter point. Again, we mentioned earlier, we saw this rally while they were still hiking away. Seems like we're near that light at the end of the tunnel. Obviously, we'll see in due time how things respond. Although I just keep wondering, if the metals rallied like this while they were getting close to the end, what happens after they actually stop altogether? You can comment if you think they're going to be reversing course at some point, but just any thoughts in general, as it seems like they're getting towards the end here.
Yeah, I think echo kind of what you just said, is ultimately if we take a pause, it'll be really interesting to see where, from a monetary aspect, especially for gold, and ultimately a byproduct of that, silver, where prices go. I mean, a reversion of course, and loosening of policy, which will happen. It's just a question of when it will happen. I mean, those are just your normal cycles, and how much can the broader markets withstand higher interest rates? Maybe for a little bit, but ultimately we've seen over the last 15, 20 years that we've come accustomed to very low interest rates, and ultimately that's where I think they'll eventually loosen, because I just find it hard to believe that the consumers can handle these interest rates with the levels of debt that we have. And so ultimately, if we pause, you can see a bit of a slowdown here in price uptick on silver or gold, but I don't see that. I think it's going to continue to push upwards, and obviously if they start to reverse course, I think that accelerates that, and we see higher and higher prices. And it's going to be really interesting 2 years. I mean, we haven't seen interest rates like this for a long time, and it'll be, like I say, maybe not a good thing, but an interesting component to see how it affects our consumers in North America.
It sure will be, and I think there's a lot of people looking forward to that. I don't know if it's net a great situation for the world we're in, but at least in terms of some of the dynamics we're talking about, will be interesting path going forward. Dan, if we could turn it over to the company side, I know we have a lot of Endeavour fans in our audience, and perhaps we can start with the production, as you recently released that about a week ago. Full year production, 9 million silver equivalent ounces. And perhaps you could walk through the developments there and how things came out in 2022.
Yeah, I think we had a great year in 2022, and we followed up from a great 2021. In 2021, we revised our guidance upwards, and we beat that guidance. This year or this past year in 2022, similarly, we revised our guidance upwards, and we actually blew that number out of the water. We came in at 9. Our expectation was going to be just over 8.0 million in our revised guidance. So kudos to our operating team to be able to deliver. Now, part of that has had to do with better grades out of Guanaceví than what we had planned. We took a conservative approach in our reserve calculations, and I'm glad that we were able to beat that. And we were able to also supplement our production with some local ore that we told through the plant that also pushed up our grades at Guanaceví. So Guanaceví had a phenomenal 2022. And Bolañitos was probably as expected, a little bit lower grades with a little bit better tonnage. So our production results, as I say, exceeded plan and came in very well. Expectation then for 2023 is that we want to perform again. And I know you'll probably pull that up. There it is, that we expect to do about 9 million or 8.6 to 9.5 million ounces of silver equivalent for 2023, with a balance of that coming from Guanaceví with higher grades. And hopefully one of the main aspects we want to focus on for 2023 is keeping our costs under control and putting real good focus in on that from an operating standpoint. So that's the goal this year, is to continue to kind of hit our targets from a production standpoint, and then hold costs to where they're at, if not drive them down if we can.
Yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to touch on in terms of the cost. Obviously, you're facing these inflation costs, especially from a mining side. How have you been able to handle that in the past year, and anything in particular you could share there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. At the end of the day, you need your inputs. And if you can cut your inputs, you got to ask why couldn't you cut those inputs before and improve your margins anyway? And Bolañitos, I think we've done what we can. I think from an input standpoint, we're kind of operating in line with where our underlying drivers are. At Guanaceví, I think there is opportunities to improve productivity there, and that's going to be a little bit of the drivers for 2023's costs come down. The inflation where we're seeing it on steel was significant for us last year, and ultimately diesel prices are up, but diesel's not a big cost for us as an underground vein miner. Some cost increase in reagents, particularly cyanide last year. We think that's going to kind of abate and get steady, if not come down a little bit. So we do see some light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to cost increases from an inflationary standpoint, but some of it's just there, and it's going to be there through 2023. And we got to do the best to manage that by managing how we want to always manage our company, and that's making sure we're making good decisions when we're following our processes and procedures to make sure we get the best prices we can for our inputs, and use the right amount of inputs to deliver our productivity. And I fully believe in our operating team. Like I say, we had a great 2022 from a production standpoint. We just got to kind of get a little bit more focused on costs. And that's the normal kind of evolution of a company, or a cycle of a company, is there's always something to work on and try to get better at. And for us this year, it's cost protection at our cost, mitigating our cost increases at Guanaceví and Bolañitos.
That makes a lot of sense. And in terms of going back to the 2022 production, something that you mentioned earlier, which I know a lot of people are familiar with, perhaps some have not heard, but you did withhold some inventory in 2022, and was wondering if you could just talk about that process. Obviously not an easy decision, because we don't ever know which way the price is going to go for sure, especially in the short term, but something that certainly a lot of people are interested in. And if you could walk through the decision to withhold, and then you ended up selling some of that metal in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, I mean, we have a great balance sheet right now. We have over 110 $120 million in working capital. $70 million of that was in cash. At the end of Q3, we had about $35 million in bullion at market prices, and that was probably at $20 silver. We are going to be building our Terronera project in 2023, so we always had the idea that we weren't necessarily going to hold on to bullion for long term, but we also weren't going to sell into a falling market. And I mean, at the end of the Q2 and end of Q3, I think we saw $2-3 drops in the price of silver in the last month, and even in the last couple of weeks. And with the way our balance sheet was and our need for cash, we made the decision that we'd hold on to that. And happily in the fourth quarter, we were able to sell some of that metal for higher prices, and not always going to be able to beat the market in that sense. I think it's a fool's game a little bit, but time was on our side, and when you have time on your side, it's a benefit. And selling silver at 22, 23, $24 felt a lot better than selling at 18 and $19. And it's not a huge impact. I mean, we have effectively almost over 800 million ounces defined in the ground as resources. So, I mean, there's a lot more leverage to what we have in the ground than what we necessarily were carrying on the balance sheet. But at times to time, when things make a lot of sense and logical sense for us at this time, we try to follow it. And so holding back in Q2, Q3 made sense, and then sold it in Q4. And it's a strategy. I don't know when we're going to do it or how often we're going to do it, but it's something we've done in the past. We did it in 2022, and we'll probably do it again in the future. It just has to make sense.
Okay, and another thing that I was hoping you could touch on at Terranera, you're in pre-construction, getting closer to making the formal construction decision.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could walk through what we're looking at there.
Yeah, I mean, we're typically, when I'm out talking to shareholders, the discussion gets geared towards Terranera, and that's the future of our company. And Terranera for us is going to completely change the landscape of our company. Taglines historically been it's going to double our production and cut our cost profile in half. When Terranera comes online, it's going to be one of the lowest cost producing assets amongst the primary silver producers, producing effectively all the gold will pay for the silver production and some, especially at today's prices. So it's literally a Class A asset. Last year, we've continued to move it forward. We put out a feasibility study in 2021, 2022. We've optimized that. We have been working on project loan financing for a portion of it, about $100 million of the build cost. The rest of that's going to be paid for off our balance sheet. It's been relatively successful, slow, very slow, but we hope to have an announcement here in the first quarter, so we can have a formal construction decision. But with that, we spent $41 million advancing Terranera last year. We committed close to 80 or over $80 million. We have a mobile fleet already on site. We've got 12 of the key components of the plant was ordered that's arriving here in 2023. Earthworks has started. Our temporary camp was up. We started our permanent camp. So we've been moving pretty quickly with Terranera. It's an exciting time for us. It's something we've never done. We never built a project from scratch, but I think we have a great team in place. Don Grayer is our COO, had built previous mines prior to joining us. He's developed our team into about 60 people. That's going to grow this year in 2023. And like I say, hopefully we have a formal construction decision here in the first quarter, and put some more details out about the optimization that we've done at Terranera, and then timelines to get that into commercial production. So exciting 2023 for Endeavour.
Yeah, and you mentioned that that's the first time you've done it from scratch. I'm just curious, what's that been like for you, going through a whole new set of challenges and a whole new process that has its own risks and hurdles that come up, which, especially in mining, never perhaps as straightforward as we imagine it being. But
Yeah,
what's that been like?
I mean, there's anxiety there. There's always a little bit of stress, of course, but it's paid to do, and how we manage it. I think having guys who have experience doing it, us as a company have never done it, but Don built the Barraquita mine in Colombia that sold to Zinjin with Continental Gold. Prior to that, he was in Guatemala with the Escobal mine, and being world-class assets. He brings a wealth of experience to it. We have obviously daily discussions about it and weekly plans, and so I'm comfortable with the processes we've put in place. It's not that Endeavour's never built anything. I mean, when we had the El Cubo plant, we had a $36 million plant that we built on time, on budget. So we have a little bit of experience with it. But as you know, Guanaceví was an old historical district with an old plant there. We bought for $7 million. Here we are 17 years later, still operating out of there. And Bolañitos, similarly, it was an old plant running about 200 tons per day. We bought it for about $7.5 million. And obviously over time we've done a lot of different capital projects and been able to manage that. But for us, Terranera is a virgin discovery and organic growth through our exploration team. And we've done, I think, 3 pre-feasibility studies, a feasibility study, other technical reports. We've had different engineering groups look at it. So we have a lot of confidence in the work that we've done on paper have confidence in the team. We've done it. We just got to go execute, and then we can say Endeavor's done it.
Well, it's exciting to see how you've been moving it forward, and been a busy year for you last year. As one other thing I wanted to ask you about was that you had a mineral resource estimate at the Pitarrilla project, and perhaps you could give us an update on how things are coming along there.
Yeah. I mean, for us, after Terranera, it's what comes next. If we can get into development there here shortly, and we see Pitarrilla being one of those projects. We bought that last year. We closed the deal with SSR in July for $70 million, $35 million in cash, $35 million in shares. As you can see from this release on the 8th of December, we updated a historical resource that they had prepared back in 2012, released 600 million ounces of silver plus lead and zinc. So that's not a total equivalence. That's 600 million ounces of silver plus lead and zinc between indicated and inferred. It's a project that's literally one of the largest silver deposits in the world. Comes with significant amount of zinc and some lead, and it's in Durango. It's an hour from our exploration office. We've got good infrastructure around it. SSR's team did a really good job on the Pitarrilla project. In 2012, they put out a feasibility study on open pit concept. But in 2009, they put out a pre-feasibility study on an underground concept. And I mean, we're underground vein miners, right? So we understand it from an underground sense, and we've got some work to do from an exploration standpoint. We want to prove up a couple things that are sitting in our head, and that's what we'll do this year. There's an adit that's about 200 meters away from a high-grade area. We want to push that adit about 200 meters, put some cross cuts in there so we can put some exploration rigs underground and drill that. So we're going to probably drill about 3,000 to 5,000 meters in 2023. And then look at probably in 2024, look at kind of an underground concept again at Pitarrilla that we have high expectations for. So again, as our goal and what I've previously talked about with Endeavour is we're trying to become a senior silver producer, and a lot of the senior silver producers have picked up gold assets over the years, and you've seen that production profile geared towards base metals or gold, and we're 60% silver, 40% gold, and bringing Terranera in 60% silver, 40% gold. Pitarrilla would also be about 60% silver and really propel us into that kind of 20-25 million ounce production range. Which gets us right behind the senior silver producers, kind of almost even in that discussion. So we're really excited about what Pitarrilla can bring for the company. And like I say, there's a year and a half, maybe even 2 years worth of work there, but something that can fit in really nicely behind Terranera once that's done in current commercial production.
Yeah, and certainly a good position to be in given the macro picture and the silver deficit that we're seeing combined all with that. Last one I wanted to ask you about before we wrapped up, the Peril project, where you have some drilling planned as well for this year, and give an update on how that is looking and the plans there.
Yeah, Perel's been in our portfolio since 2016. We've proven up 43 million ounces as of the end of 2019 because of COVID. We really didn't drill in 2020. We couldn't get drillers in country. In 2021, midway through the year, got drill rigs going, and then continued that in 2022 with better grades and better widths than what we'd previously seen. It is an old historical district. So we're actually drilling below old workings. There are plants in the area. So it's a different scale than what Pitarrilla would be. It'd be smaller, and depending on where the marketplace is, because no one's got a crystal ball, but if we're in a price environment that we were last year, maybe that's a project that comes in after Terranera. It'd be something more of a 2,000 tons per day, a lot lower capital cost that you could leverage Terranera's cash flows off of if prices aren't higher. But it really gives us a really nice portfolio mix to try to get, like I say, to that 20 million ounce production standpoint. So for us, we'll continue to work at Pitarrilla, we'll continue to work at Perel, and let the markets decide what comes next. So like I say, Endeavour's really positioned extremely well for hopefully what ends up being higher silver prices over the next kind of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, it sounds like a nice blend of increasing production and going into this environment we're facing. So well done on everything that you put together, and certainly shaping up to be an interesting year for you guys in 2023. And perhaps, Dan, just in closing, can you let folks know if they have questions, would like to get more information, or go over any of the projects? What's the best way to do that?
Best way is actually through our website, edrsilver.com. And ultimately, I think we have an Outlook address on there that would get you in contact with the head of our investor relations, and we can help answer any questions there. Obviously, we have under our investors tab, we have our corporate presentation and any information you want to know about Endeavour. We also have an area about silver and information about the silver market and uses of silver. So our website's a great start.
Well, Dan, I appreciate that. Appreciate what you're doing in the silver world. Obviously, not the easiest path that we choose with some of these things in silver, although great to see the way that things rebounded last year and that you kept moving the projects forward and really setting your company up to be in good shape going forward. So thanks again for joining me, and be interesting to see what this all looks like a year again from now.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy having our discussions, and see you soon.